Welcome, everybody. I think we'll start now. Welcome to ACLED's Conflict Index July 2023 update. My name is Clionadh Raleigh. I'm the president and CEO of ACLED. I'm joined today by Katayoun Kishi, who is the head of data science, and we will be presenting our updated and revised conflict index for you today. At the end of our presentation, Hugh Pope will be the moderator and lead us through some questions. We hope you enjoy it, and please feel free to engage with the chat and with any questions you may have. Next slide, please. So for those of you familiar with the indices that are available, as you know, there are many of them. And one of the things we wanted to do is to use our own data, so ACLED's own collection of politically violent data, to create an index about how violent was the world in general. Now, we wanted to do this in a very different way than how typical indices are done. We only wanted to use the violent information we had available and that we knew was coded very robustly and rigorously. And we also kept on coming across questions such as how many conflicts occur in the world. But it was very difficult to indicate what a conflict was, given that it could be an interaction between an armed group and a government or two armed groups. And it struck us that the question, how many conflicts are there happening in the world at any one time, didn't really discuss or consider the dimensions of violence that we knew existed. And so we wanted to take the dimensions that we believe are most important, which include deadliness, danger, fragmentation, and diffusion of conflict, and use those to ascertain how violent the world was. And in fact, we were able to do so through this conflict index. And we've changed some of the specifications, which Katayoun will get into. But what we were able to find is that 50 countries are quite violent in the world at present. And so when we ask how much conflict is occurring in the world, we can look at both extreme high and turbulent levels of conflict and identify which countries fall into those, using those four dimensions we spoke about before. So we're not counting the number of conflicts, we're counting in some ways, or we're measuring those dimensions of violence. So in the ACLED Conflict Index, which you can see here as a summary, what we'll do is walk you through how we managed to come up with these indicators and what it means for the larger patterns of violence that we're seeing in the world today. We're going to answer three questions: how much conflict is occurring in the world, where is that conflict occurring, and whether that conflict is worsening or improving. On the website where we introduced the index, there are some metrics there beyond the 50 countries that I've mentioned here, including that 1 in 6 of us live in environments where conflict is occurring very close to where we live. And in fact, there's been a 27% increase in conflict in the last calendar year, and that's largely because of Ukraine. Next, please. So our question of how much conflict is occurring, that can be quite difficult. As many of you may know, ACLED collects all reported and recorded events of political violence and demonstrations. And so what we find is that over the 240 territories and countries we cover, there is a majority, about 167, that saw at least one incident of political violence within the last 12 months. But the raw number of events can tell us a very important aspect of violence, but can't tell us the full story. So we recorded 139,000 politically violent events worldwide during the last 12 months. And in fact, that was almost matched in the conservative number of fatalities we recorded at 147. But what we were looking for is to try to determine really in which countries are we seeing really quite desperate levels and severe levels of conflict, and where do we have a one-off event that doesn't indicate political and social breakdown. And so to do that, we created a range, which, as I mentioned before, is based on those four parameters of deadliness, danger, diffusion, and fragmentation. And we were able to place countries, all the 167, based on how they are weighed in those ranges. And we were able to then, as a result, come up with this index in which Myanmar is, according to our index, the most conflicted, the most violent place in the world at present. It's also the country with the most active groups. So if you will recall, when I mentioned fragmentation, it referred to how many active groups, non-state active groups, that are armed and organized within your territory and conducting violence. And of course, Mexico is our most dangerous country to civilians. Ukraine is the most deadly in terms of the number of fatalities as a ratio to events, and Palestine has the most diffuse violence across its territory, which of course, being a relatively small place, that is in some ways influenced by that, which Katayoun will discuss. But many of the countries that you would expect to see on this list are either in the extreme area, which is the red here, or in the high area, which is the salmon color. And so next, please. What we wanted to do was to give people a real sense of, given these 4 parameters and given the data being collected in the exact same way, where is this conflict distributed? And what we find is a little bit counter to how most people understand where violence is in the world. So there's some typical characters here, of course. As I mentioned, the most violent place according to our index is in Myanmar. That's closely followed by Syria and Mexico, and then Ukraine, Nigeria, Brazil, Yemen, Iraq, Congo, and Colombia. And what strikes us about this extreme list is that rather than being located in one region of the world, what we find is a representation of almost every region in this extreme list. And rather than it being a function of whether or not there is a single civil war or threat to the government, the conflicts that are represented, especially on these extreme 10 countries here, really run the range of conflicts between groups, cartels or gangs, to conflicts with the government, or in some cases, like Mexico, a very low rate of government engagement with the armed groups active within that territory. And so it tells us that the dimensions of conflict as they are currently occurring across the world both deviate quite significantly from our interpretation of civil wars and insurgencies, but that we have a much more significant problem in that there are literally thousands of groups operating and producing violence that affects civilians, state security, stability, etc. And they are becoming, in aggregate, so extreme as to match, if not surpass, typical levels of political violence that we would associate with a war. Next, please. One of the most interesting conclusions we have drawn from this is that, again, in counter to typical interpretations or expectations of violence that we would have, that there is no pre-assumed or predetermined likelihood that a country is going to be violent because it is also relatively poor or run by non-democratic government. In fact, here what we have is mapping the 50 countries that I mentioned that we identified as either being turbulent, high, or extreme. And what we do is we rank them by the UN Human Development categories. And what you find is that while at the very, very high development levels, there are a few turbulent countries, in both the categories of high development, medium development, and as expected, low development, there is a range not just of turbulent or relatively less conflict, but in fact, high and extreme countries that are highly developed or subject to medium development or low development across this range. So typical indices, as I mentioned in the beginning, tend to associate poverty and violence. But what we can show here is that conflict is happening across the development scale. Not only is it happening across the development scale, but it's also becoming more frequent at higher levels of development than lower levels of development. And this can really throw into question some of the assumed theories about conflict that we've been working from for, I would say, the last 20 years, about where we should expect it and what form it should take. If there's no relationship between poverty and violence, then our conceptions of fragility or even state failure need to be reconciled with the current geography of conflict we see here. So neither Mexico, Ukraine, nor Colombia, nor Brazil are incredibly low developed, belong in the category of low development, and yet they host some of the most extreme levels of violence that the world is currently seeing. Next, please. The same can be said for effectively non-democratic government or free governments, partially free or not free governments. We all expect that there is going to be a relatively higher rate of violence in countries deemed not free. However, when we looked at this and mapped them across areas that were free, considered relatively free by Freedom House, and partially free, again by the same organization, we can see that, in fact, it is not a lack of democracy that is leading to higher rates of violence. Sometimes, in fact, it is the practice of democracy, the transition to and from democracy, that is giving rise to the political competition that is in turn giving rise to this conflict. And one of the things that we have come away from this index pretty sure of is that the conflicts we see here are not because of, as I mentioned, state fragility, state poverty, or some sort of lacking state services. In fact, it's deeply political, the number of groups that have emerged and where they have emerged and under which conditions they have emerged indicate that these conflicts are about political competition. It is a fight for control of authority within local, regional, and even the national arenas. And it causes us to maybe reconsider some of the more simplified explanations we've had for why we would see conflict in some countries, and instead start to understand the trade-offs inherent in moving from a not free to partially free to totally free country, and how that doesn't necessarily alleviate or doesn't unburden a population from the threat of violence that they may experience. And so again, just to summarize this, we have 50 countries in which we find extreme high and turbulent rates of political violence that have continued over the last 12 months. Those countries go from lesser developed states to highly developed states. They go from not free to free, but there is not a consistent relationship between having lower rates of violence and higher rates of development. In fact, that relationship looks, from these two graphs that I've just shown you, almost void. And we have to, again, reconsider what we believe to be the underlying factors giving rise to violence that would cause countries like Mexico, Nigeria, and Colombia and Brazil to remain so high on this list, and yet already have done the work of becoming, let's say, relatively free democracies, etc. Next, please. We also wanted to consider, of course, whether or not conflict was worsening or improving. And what we find, of course, is that 39 of the 50 we have identified experienced sustained or escalated levels of conflict compared to 2018. And this is quite serious. Not only have I already mentioned that there's been a 27% rise in event numbers in the last 12 months, but effectively, the vast majority of cases within those 50 countries we've identified as being violent have become worse in the past 5 years rather than improving. And here are a number of them that I will be commenting on a little bit more in a while, including Haiti, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, and of course, Ukraine. In all of these cases, the countries that have become worse, there is not just a worsening of the governance that people experience, of course, but also of the number of challenges and the number of armed groups that are present in country that create the violence that people are exposed to. As I mentioned, 1 in 6 of us have violence in approximate area to our home. But of these most violent countries that I've mentioned in the high and extreme category, the number is 1 in 3. And that is an incredibly high rate of exposure for the people living in these countries. And of course, of those where conflict is worsening, we would expect an increased number of people to be exposed to that violence. I'm going to now turn it over to Katayoun, who will talk a little bit more about the measures before we return to talk a little bit more about the details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clionadh. So, like she mentioned, I wanted to go into how we created the index, what the methodology is behind it, and what these specific indicators that Clionadh mentioned really kind of mean. So, The overall goal of the index really was to look at conflict in a different way than the ways in which you might typically see it discussed. So not limiting ourselves to the framework of civil wars or outside state aggression, just looking at fatalities, for example, in order to measure how intense a conflict might be. The idea was if you look at conflict in that way, then you're going to be missing some of the deadliest, most dangerous, fragmented and diffuse conflicts around the world. So the four indicators that we include in the index are deadliness, which looks at fatality levels, diffusion, which looks at the geographic spread of conflict in a country, danger, which looks specifically at violence that targets civilians, and then fragmentation, which looks at how many different groups are active in that space. Next slide. So I'll start with deadliness. Of course, looking at fatalities is a really key element of looking at any conflict and trying to assess its intensity. So it's a really good measure of looking at the human cost of conflict. To calculate the indicator, we use the number of fatalities that resulted from political violence in a country. ACLED designates in the data set which events are events of political violence. This includes the event types of battles, explosions and remote violence, violence against civilians, and then the sub-event types of mob violence and excessive force against protesters. So any fatalities that arose from one of those types of events was included here. And again, we use the fatalities column of the ACLED data set. If you wanted to look at which events are political violence events, you can look at the disorder type column of the ACLED data set as well. One thing to note whenever anyone is looking at fatalities is that fatalities can be subject to significant bias, whether that's overcounting or undercounting. In the sense of overcounting, you have situations in which people might be inflating the number of casualties that occurred, and in undercounting, depending on the source, they might be inclined to underreport the number of fatalities that they suffered. There's also the potential of fatality counts changing as people succumb to injuries over time. So in all, this makes it quite difficult to get a very specific exact number of fatalities. And that's something that we've written a lot about at ACLED. There's a lot of methodology documents on our website that go into more detail about the sort of bounds of using fatality numbers. Next slide. So next we wanted to look at the danger to civilians specifically. So almost all armed organized groups will target civilians during the course of a conflict. And this can change based on various sort of developments in the conflict, territorial changes, struggles for power, group competition, and so on. So we thought it was important to also take into account how the conflict is affecting civilian populations. To do this, we use the number of violence targeting civilians events in the given country. So again, you can really easily find which events qualify as civilian targeting by using the civilian targeting column in the ACLED data set. And I do want to note as well that this is different from our violence against civilians event type. It includes all events that are in that event type, but it also includes other events that target civilians that may not be classified as violence against civilians event type, just because it might involve elements of another type of event, like an explosion or active remote violence. So I would recommend looking at that column in the ACLED data set to get a sense of where civilians are being targeted around the world. Next slide. So next we looked at diffusion. Here we sort of changed a bit the way that we were calculating this indicator compared to the first iteration of the index that came out earlier in 2023. So in that iteration, we had looked at the percentage of Admin 1 first level administrative divisions in the country that had a high level of weekly violence. And what we had found there was that this can be subject to some bias depending on the number of administrative divisions in a country. So countries with fewer admins meant that they would rank higher in this indicator. So we tweaked it a bit to get a bit more of an accurate measurement of the diffusion of violence in a country. So here we wanted to look at geographically how widespread is the conflict. Now this is important for a few reasons. As you can imagine, conflicts that are spread out over the entirety of a country can be a lot more difficult to resolve, both for the government, or it creates a lot more competition between groups and a lot more opportunities for them to target civilians and so on, compared to conflicts that are very isolated in only specific parts of a country. So to measure this, we essentially took the geographic space of a country and divided it up into 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer grids, excluding areas of a country that are uninhabited. So mountain ranges, deserts, anywhere where the population was fewer than 100 people living there. So among these inhabited places in the country, we then overlaid ACLED data to see how often these areas experienced violence. We used the 90 percentile threshold, so looking at grids in the country that experienced 10 or more violent events, political violence events during the course of a year. So depending on the number of grids that saw this level of violence, we took a percentage essentially of the country that is experiencing high levels of conflict. We used geolocation data from the ACLED data set, as well as population data from our friends at WorldPop to find the inhabited or uninhabited places. One thing to note here, you still will run into a problem of smaller countries tending to score more highly on the diffusion scale, just because it's easier, frankly, to have conflict spread out over a small area of a small country. But still, we find that some of these small countries, Palestine, Haiti, for example, that have high levels of political violent diffusion in the country, do have quite high or extreme levels of violence, especially among the other indicators as well. Next slide. So lastly, we have the fragmentation indicators. So here we really wanted to get at how many different groups are active in a conflict. This can, of course, make it more difficult to resolve a conflict when you have lots of different groups with different agendas vying for power in a space. It can make it difficult to engage with actors, to come to consensus and sort of cooperate between them. So for this, we calculated the number of distinct active non-state armed groups. These include rebel groups, political militias, identity militias that are active in the country during the course of the 12-month period that we were looking at. This does not include unidentified armed groups, and we also limited it to one communal group per admin one, just so that we don't overinflate the number of communal militias that we calculate. We also included pro-government militias as well here. To collect this information, we used the Actor 1, Actor 2, Associate Actor columns of the ACLED dataset. And you can really easily find which groups are rebel groups versus political militias versus identity militias by looking at the intercolumns of the ACLED dataset. Those are numerical values that are assigned to each primary actor in the dataset that designates whether it's a rebel group or a political militia and so on. And you can find all that information in the code book as well on the website. Next slide. So I'll run through quickly how we then devised the overall ranking that you saw in some of the visuals that Clionadh shared earlier. So first thing we did was calculate the sort of raw metrics for each country within each indicator. So for deadliness, it would be the number of fatalities. For diffusion, it would be the percentage of the country's area that experienced high levels of violence. We then took those numbers and ranked them within each indicator. So each country was then ranked. Next, we looked at each country's 4 rankings. So their ranking in the deadliness, danger, fragmentation, and diffusion indicators and took an average of that score. Next, we then ranked it yet again, one last time, looking at those average scores, ranking them amongst all countries. And then that gives us sort of the final ranking that you see. So just to sort of illustrate this, if a country is 3rd in overall deadliness, 10th in diffusion, 4th in danger, and 7th in the fragmentation list, they might have gotten an average score of 6. Then comparing that average score to other countries, they perhaps would have ranked in the 3rd overall position in the ranking. Happy to answer any questions about this as well. I know that we got some questions before the session as well on methodology, so we can go into that as well during the Q&A. Okay, so at this point, I will share my screen so that you can see the tool that we've created to go along with the index. Can everyone see my screen? View, does it look okay? Great. So this is the landing page for the conflict index. And if you go down to downloads and tools, you'll see the link to the interactive index dashboard. So if you go into this dashboard, this is what it will look like. This gives you a really hands-on way of being able to play around with the results and really see and search for the different countries that you might be interested in. So for example, on the right-hand side, we have the overall conflict index rankings. You can search for a certain country that you're interested in. You can sort it by the level that it scored on the index, extreme, high, turbulent, or low. You have the total rank, that's what I just described, sort of looking at across all the rankings, what the average was, and creating an overall rank for the country, as well as you can see where it ranked within each of the other indicators. So for Myanmar, for example, it ranked 2nd in deadliness, 8th in diffusion, 4th in danger, and 1st in fragmentation. And that meant that overall, it scored sort of the highest among all countries, and that's where it landed with the overall #1 ranking. Now let me refresh this because it opened for too long. So here we can see on the left-hand side where you can kind of interact with it and compare different countries. So for example, here we have Myanmar, Syria, and Mexico, where you can see how they sort of compare to one another. In Myanmar, the orange line, you see that it's highly fragmented, and you can hover over to see exactly what the score was that it got within that index, relative, sort of scaled between 0 and 1. You can see here that Mexico, for example, is very high on the danger scale. You can see that Syria favors diffusion more so than fragmentation, and so on. This scale here overall in this chart is relative to all countries globally, which is useful when you have countries that are sort of at the top of the index like this. But you can also see it within the selected countries, how they compare to each other. And this can be useful if you're trying to compare a country that scored overall quite low on the index. And I can show you what that looks like as well. But here you can see really relative to each other what the various scores looked like and the sort of composite breakdown of a country. You can go here to select various other countries to compare to each other. So for example, we can pick these 3. And you can see here, when you're looking at this scaled globally, it's quite difficult to see what's happening because these countries ranked lower, sort of relative to a lot of other countries on the index. So if we click here to seeing it just within the selected countries, so scaling it to the numbers of just the countries that you selected, it's a lot easier to see sort of the distribution here of how they change. So for example, Afghanistan has a completely different makeup than Haiti. So Haiti, for example, highly diffuse conflict, quite high in fatalities and fragmentation, and less so in danger to civilians. Whereas in Afghanistan, the conflict is largely centered on violence that targets civilians and fatalities, with not a lot of groups that are active, and also with it being quite concentrated in certain geographic spaces in the country. So with that, I will wrap up my portion. I'll hand it back over to Hugh to lead us through any Q&As and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to say congratulations to your team. It's a fabulous piece of work and a wonderful resource, so clear and so unique as well. We've got about 12 questions have come through, so we'll have to go through them quite quickly, I think. First of all, I'd like to turn to you, Clionadh. You've explained that this eye-catching 27% up in the past year is due mainly to Ukraine. If you step back a bit and look at the last 5 years, is there something you can say a bit more than 19 countries improved and 19 countries worsened, which I see was what you said? Is there an overall percentage change in the number of political violence events, for instance?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I would say that what we're looking at is, of course, a drastic increase in numbers because of, as previously discussed, the increase in Ukraine is something like 900 events per week. You know, in addition to all of the others quite active conflicts that we mentioned have already worsened. But there are a few themes here that I think really underlie the index as a whole, which is that even the countries in the high and extreme categories, they are hosting multiple conflicts, not simply one conflict. And those conflicts are proliferating. So even if, for example, in Iraq, one militia might dissipate, might actually be kind of engaged with another militia, or become part of civil society or stop being violent, often several others will come up at the same time to take their place. And that is one of the main problems we're seeing, which is why fragmentation is such an important element to that. The second is, of course, these conflicts that have many active groups, they're often fighting each other as much as they're fighting the state. And so solutions for engaging with them have typically tended to be state-led or state-focused. And that's not particularly good at dealing with the conflicts that we're seeing here populate these lists. The third, of course, as I mentioned, is militias are playing a leading role in this violence. So it's not as if civil wars are holding their own. They are decreasing. And in fact, the amount of violence perpetrated by rebels or those with a kind of a national agenda have decreased significantly, and they've been replaced with these other groups. And that also means, of course, is that, as we see in places like Colombia, the peace agreements that are designed to bring overall stability to a country can really only speak to a smaller part of the violence now, rather than the violence as a whole. And as we went over in detail, it's really middle-income countries with some democratic features where we're seeing the greatest rise. And that's perhaps the most worrying phenomena, in that the solutions that we've had to kind of develop out of violence are not going to work in these cases.
Excellent. Clionadh, I'm just going to carry on a bit about the overall list, because it seems counterintuitive that despite this full-scale war in Ukraine being the deadliest conflict, as you mentioned, 1/3 of all the events that you've recorded, it still falls behind Myanmar, falls behind Syria, falls behind Mexico. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as Katayoun just showed, where countries rather than people ranked in that list, Ukraine is fourth because it ranks 27th on the fragmentation. So there isn't a lot of fragmentation within the Ukrainian conflict. It's a bit of a throwback in the sense that it's a very, very traditional conflict, rather than Myanmar, which might be considered a very modern conflict, because Myanmar has over 1,000 active militias currently fighting both each other and, of course, the state. So when we compare these two conflicts, we can really appreciate the fact that solely by event numbers, we're not going to get at the dimensions that we spoke about earlier that can really highlight how conflict currently looks and how it's experienced. Perhaps
I could go a bit further into Mexico, and perhaps since this is really data, we could turn to you, Katayoun. Indoor Bugarin asks, particularly, how come Mexico's so high in the list?
Yeah, so Mexico ranks highest in our sort of danger category. So looking at violence that targets civilians. And so again, kind of like how Clionadh was mentioning, the way that we constructed the results of the index looks across all of the various indicators to see overall, holistically, how does a country rank? So looking at Mexico, for example, it ranks 3rd overall, and it's number 1 as far as danger and violence that targets civilians, but it's also 5th highest in terms of overall fatalities. It's 6th highest in terms of fragmentation, so the number of mostly gang violence and gangs that we see that are active in that space. But then it also ranks 18th as far as diffusion, so quite further down the list when it comes to how widespread geographically the conflict is. So that's why it ranks, for example, behind Myanmar or Syria in the overall index. But that's the sort of key thing to keep in mind, is that a country, while they might rank quite high in one specific indicator, you have to also take into account how they might perform on the other indicators to assess sort of the overall ranking that it receives.
As the index shows, that wealth is not a guarantee of peace, and Mexico we generally think of as having escaped the traps of poverty. But anyway, Clionadh, to go back to that thing that you're showing, not just that the poverty is not a precursor, but also that a higher development and freer countries also seem as vulnerable to conflict as the poor ones. And I was really surprised to see that the US had entered the top 50 as a turbulent country. What is that? Is that new? What does that mean?
That's an excellent question and very unfortunate. So in the US, when we started collecting information, it was 2020, and there was a confluence of circumstances there that created kind of a perfect storm. You know, there was a social justice movement that took off and really kind of engulfed the country, and there was also, of course, as the pandemic drew out, there was also kind of both pro and anti-pandemic legislation, protests, and instability. And of course, there was the election between Trump, the first election potentially between Trump and Biden. And those three things made the US really kind of explode in terms of demonstrations, but also political violence. I mean, the number of militias that were present or active in many states had reached an all-time high at the time we were recording them. We don't know, for example, if it will continue being like this, of course, into the next election year, or whether that was a bit of a perfect storm. But what we can say is that the US has reached a level of demonstrations, including riots and potential mob violence, that it's managing to sustain rather than decrease from, even in non-election years. And that is, I think, unsettling quite a number of people, because it's highly localized, this violence, with the exception, of course, of January 6th. And it has a lot of fuel to keep going with the US political system.
At the other end of the scale, it seems almost tragic that one country that is the top improver on your list is Libya. And this is the country that was hit by these dreadful floods in the recent days that have killed 10 to 20,000 people. Perhaps just to raise the morale of anyone in Libya, can you tell us what's been going right in Libya? Is there anything you can detail from us from your data?
Oh, nothing's going right, unfortunately. No, it's just that the many, many militias that were present in Libya have become formalized, if you will. They've sought other means of expressing their power. They're often, for example, given low-level or even regional level work as civil servants, or people working within the civil service. There's currently 2 governments in Libya that can claim territorial control, and they keep in both quite a selection of militias that are, as you mentioned, they're certainly less active, but I would call those latent rather than dissipated. But that said, I think that what this can show is that when you have not a breakdown of public order, but a contest for order like this, all of the energy in society, all of the economics get turned to it, all of the politics is about sustaining this contest, and everyday things like infrastructure improvements don't get prioritized, which is why you get disasters, unfortunately, at a relatively high rate in countries that are also experiencing conflict.
An excellent point, exactly, yes. The question list is filling up with things about methodology, so I'm going to turn back to you, Katayoun, if I may. You've explained in great detail already how the 4 indicators are measured, but is there anything more you'd like to say about how you created the tool? And there have been particular questions, for instance, from Tekaline Seketa asks about the 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer indicator, and asks in particular, will that be available to researchers? Daniel Mittermeier asks why you don't account for the size of countries' populations in overall deadliness. Perhaps that just needs a little explaining. David Russell asks about deadliness. Does that mean fatalities? And there's other questions in general about sources and maritime domains. So pick the ones you'd like. I mean, maritime domains, and specifically from Sally Daltrey asking whether you will include things in the EEZs of countries. So a lot of questions, but perhaps first the 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer indicator.
Sure, yeah. This is great. Thank you, everyone, for all these methodology questions. So we will make the sort of data available in the sense of, one thing I should have pointed out in the tool that I was demoing, there's a download file button there where you can download all of the results of the index by country. So that will give you both the raw and the scaled value for each indicator. So in the diffusion sense, that will give you the exact percentage of the country's geography that is experiencing high levels of violence. If you wanted to recreate that indicator yourself, you also could, just using ACLED data and sort of overlaying it onto a population shape file as well. As far as the 10-kilometer grids, how we came up with that, it's a good question. We played around a lot with looking at different sizes for the grids. Anything too small would have been sort of too fine-grained, and anything too big would have eliminated a lot of countries that are quite small, and we would have only ended up with 2-3 grids perhaps in a country. So this was sort of the happy medium of being able to cover as much of the country and as fine-grained as possible without sort of losing some of that fidelity. We are pretty confident in the accuracy of ACLED event geolocations. One thing to note about geolocations is that in a large city, for example, we do assign coordinates to a centroid location. So you should not use ACLED data's coordinate information to perhaps try to identify a certain street corner where an event happened. And there's a few reasons for that. One being just sort of our do no harm policy of not sort of pointing out specifically where victims were targeted in a country or in a city. And also just sourcing wise, it is quite difficult to get really accurate geographic information down to, you know, a specific coordinate just from a source. So you can also then use our geoprecision column that looks at the precision of how the coordinates are sort of assigned to an event as well. So to answer your question, more or less, the 10 kilometers was kind of this Goldilocks of looking at not too big and not too small, depending on the sort of overall spread of the country. I'll look at, so is the deadliness indicator the number of fatalities or the rate of fatalities per event? It's the number of fatalities that occurred in an event. So if there were, you know, 10 deaths and then 5 in another event and 5 in another event, it would have been just the sum of that 20.
We have a question from Jonah Rudlin in general about sources. Could you just talk quickly through how you get this information? Sure,
yeah. So we cover a wide variety of sources. So all of the sourcing for the ACLED Conflict Index comes from the ACLED data itself, which are sourced really extensively. We cover traditional media, we have local partnerships on the ground that give us information, especially in places where traditional media is not very active. We source in English and local languages, which is extremely important when it comes to getting an accurate picture of a conflict. We listen to radio broadcasts, see things on social media, although I will mention we do not sort of take a Twitter fire hose and code events from that. We're only using social media from verified accounts that we know to trust, journalists, other activists on the ground, and so on. The local partnerships that I mentioned are a really key feature that helps us both kind of cross-check our information and get sort of a sense from that local partner whether what we're collecting reflects the reality that they see on the ground. And it also allows us a pipeline from that local partner if they're collecting data to send it our way as well. And we sort of have this good symbiotic relationship with a lot of local partners.
And a
lot of information on our sourcing on our website too. I'll just put in a plug to look through our methodology documents.
Indeed, I highly recommend. There's a little tab on the right. You could spend all day reading through those. Very nicely done. Do you include the maritime area, 12-mile limits, EEZs in your data? We
do include incidents that happen offshore in the data, and you'll sometimes see them coded to C of something. It might be indicated there that it occurred offshore. So yes, we do include events that occurred in the ocean.
Okay. And one final thing is that people are asking, has there been an evolution beyond what you mentioned about the change in diffusion? And is it possible to compare the current conflict severity index, which is pretty new this year, to previous indexes of any kind?
Yeah, so you can largely compare. So like Clionadh mentioned, we came out with the sort of first iteration of the conflict index earlier in 2023. And you can largely compare the results that you see there. You see that they're pretty consistent with what we have here. Although I would say that we did change some things about the methodology. So for example, with the diffusion metric, I also can point out for the civilian targeting metric, so for danger, We used to scale that by population in a country, and we no longer do. Now we just look at the number of violence targeting civilian events. And the reason we got rid of scaling it by population is we were finding some countries that have very high levels of violence that target civilians, where it's a real problem in those countries, also have extremely high populations. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, those types of places. And we were finding that we were essentially underinflating, basically undercounting the impact that violence targeting civilians has in those conflict contexts. So we got a bit more of an accurate picture of the world when we took out that population scaling there. So I would say keep that in mind when you're comparing the past iteration of this conflict index, but using the current methodology and all of the ACLED data that are available, you could quite easily recreate some of these findings and play around with it to see what's useful for your research.
Amazing. Still on definitions, can I come back to you, Clionadh? You point out that it's militia fighting that now causes most of the political violence and not the rebel groups that we normally think about. There's been a question about whether you could please define the difference between such old-fashioned rebel groups and the militias that you're talking about. And Quentin Blanchett also asks if ACLED is using the word conflict and political violence as synonyms. And Anastasia Austin is asking, does the way you're counting things mean that just pure organized crime counts as political violence?
Oh, great questions. Let me start with conflict and political violence. Yes, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm using them relatively interchangeably, but I will specify that that people speak about having a conflict, which is very different than a politically violent event. So as ACLED collects politically violent events, it is then on us to decide how to aggregate them or to categorize them in a way which we can justify based on our definitions of conflict. And one of the ways we categorize events is by who perpetrates them or who's involved in them. And what we can see from the vast array of non-state armed groups is that certain groups have what I would refer to as a national agenda. They have both a national agenda and then their actions and their diffusion, or rather like the space that they occupy for violence, is very similar to that. So those groups with a national agenda to either overtake or to assume control of the national government or create their own territory, etc., are often referred to as rebels, right? So they are rebelling against the national government. Militias, on the other hand, are often armed, organized group who operate at the behest of a political elite, often for both a regional or local political purpose. So it might be to harass people during an election. It might be to contest with another mayor, for example, about who controls an area or a resource or whatever the case. And militias have, as I mentioned before, proliferated not only because they are to put it bluntly, a cheap and useful tool of these political elites, but it's also because, as I mentioned before, many countries adopted some form of democracy, or they democratized or institutionalized in some ways over the last 20 to 30 years. And what happened is that there was a mass increase in inclusion. So many of these governments that we're talking about are highly inclusive, highly politically inclusive. And there were many positions and many new political elites, but there's still a zero-sum game that they fight about getting positions of authority, getting appointments. And so militias are a way in which those who are already inside the system contest with each other to stay inside and to gain access to more resources, to more patronage, to more authority. And so that in part explains this phenomena of militia expansion that we're seeing. They often represent an interest of somebody who is already in the political domain. And the final one was about organized crime. You know, we really struggled with organized crime because while we do not collect information on crime as it's purely defined, organized crime, and especially cartel crime, has significant political and social consequences and has a particular political and social kind of imprint that we wanted to represent in our work. And so there is available for you a document which outlines when we consider the cartel violence and which types of groups to be engaged in what we would call acts against public security and public space. And in those cases, we decided that their actions were political violence. They were not solely about the acquisition, for example, of business or criminality or illicit goods, but rather they were having larger effects, which meant that they were acting effectively as a political actor.
Very good, I suppose. Katayoun, I got a question here about automation and artificial intelligence. Are you using machine learning and artificial intelligence to construct this index? Does it help us understand the proliferation and fragmentation and deadliness of conflicts? And how's that going to develop, do you think?
So it's a big question. So no, the short answer is we do not use any sort of automation or AI in constructing the conflict index specifically. That's because ACLED data are completely coded and collected by humans, human coders, reviewed by humans at every step of the way. So that's not to say that, though, that ACLED is not exploring ways in which AI and automation can be a useful tool in the sort of gold standard, as we see it, of data collection. So what that means is we would never turn into an organization that is purely using an automated system to collect and code our data, but we can use it to speed up the process, to help our human coders and researchers in finding the most relevant information from an event, to make sourcing and collecting the information for presentation to the researchers faster. Elements like that we can and will sort of incorporate more, but the results of the index are purely based off of the information that our researchers have manually, individually collected from the extensive list of sources that they cover. I'll also put in a quick plug for where we do use machine learning with our data, which is the conflict alert system. So ACLED CAST is our predictive model that looks at how conflict might develop over time in every country around the world and in every first level administrative division in those countries. So you can find it on our website. It's updated every month. It looks at the forecast of the number of political violence events that we might see in the next 6 months into the future for a country. And it breaks it down into the exact number of events that we're looking to see. And it also provides sort of an accuracy metric as well for how the model performed in previous months, which we find to be a really important element in this conversation around automation and AI is how can we hold things accountable? How can we sort of apply the same methodological rigor that we do to human-led research projects to these AI automated ones?
Thank you, Katayoun. We've got another at least 20 or 30 questions that have come pouring in, and I'm just going to simply have to say, I'm sorry, it'll have to be for the next time. And once again, congratulations to the team for such great work. There are questions about how do you manage to find data in Myanmar? Why Haiti? I can't begin. There's at least 20 or 30 more, but perhaps we'll be able to go through them and get answers back to people later. For the meantime, since we've run out of time, over back to you, Clionadh, to wrap up the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate your attention and patience while we discuss the index. We hope that you find it useful. I perused some of the questions earlier. I think many of the answers are already available on the website under the resources and especially under the methodology or, of course, the data itself. I'd like to thank, of course, Katayoun for her excellent work on this index and for Hugh to nicely shepherding us through this process. And of course, to everybody who attended, I really appreciate it. And we hope that it is of use to you. It maybe it's inspiring a few different thoughts than before on conflict. And if so, we would love to hear from you. And hopefully we will see you again when we do an update. We are planning to do 2 updates a year. And hopefully we will see more improvements in our next update. Not of the index, Katayoun, I mean of the countries.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.